Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCG live codes, make sure you check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using that code OmniPoke. So it's the set release of Paldean Fates. It's going to be legal in a couple weeks' time. The set is mostly a collector set, but I thought we could give a quick rundown of the set review for the standard format. It's the usual OmniPoke rating system. I didn't do a community one this time around because, let's face it, the set isn't that great. So there's not going to have huge impacts, huge waves on the format, just a few standout cards that we'll zip through real quick. We'll start with the supporter cards, and we have a new Attacus supporter. This could be a nice upgrade for the Cloth Electrode Brute Bonnet deck, because it's a supporter that allows us to shuffle our hand in and draw 7 cards, but you can only activate this supporter if your opponent's active Pokemon is poisoned. So it probably still goes alongside the likes of Research and whatnot, because you need to already have your Brute Bonnet plus Capsule developed on the board, but this could be a great way for you to protect things like your double turbo energies to make sure you can continue to attack with Claw throughout the entire game and remain that one prizer as you would like. So it's possibly just coming in as a 1 or 2 count to go alongside your researchers and your other supporter cards in the Cloth Bonnet deck, which has had a number of day 2 placements, so I think it is worth mentioning. Then we have Clive. It's not the best of supporters. Your opponent reveals their hand and you draw 2 cards for each supporter card you find there. We have had some sort of similar cards in the past, like Acerolla's Premonition and Sabrina's Suggestion. These styles of supporters that sort of only have a major payoff when your opponent has a large hand size, and this, that, and the other means it's going to be pretty poor through major periods of the game. And let's face it, we have a really good number of like draw 3 plus disruption style effects that are worthwhile in the format instead of Clive right now. We have the students in Paldea, again similar to Whitney, this sort of card where it gets stronger the more that are in the discard pile. So you get to search your deck for a Pokemon that doesn't have a rule box and put it straight to your hand, but for each other student in your discard pile that isn't the one you're playing, you get to search for an additional Pokemon. So still all non-rule boxes, but eventually your final Paldean student, if there are 3 in the discard pile, is getting 4 non-rule box Pokemon. So it's like a bit of an upgrade on the likes of a Rizu that's getting just general 3, but they have to be evolution Pokemon. This can also get basics. So there are upsides here when you've eventually cycled your deck through these cards, but I really don't think it's that strong of an effect. We have plenty of great ball search. I don't think it's going to be worthwhile in any archetype. Even things like the stage 1 decks like Zoroark, they're going to be so focused on discarding the stage 1s themselves that you don't even get to discard these students all that easily either. Nimona's Backpack is an interesting item card. You get to put 2 Nimona cards from your discard pile into your hands. That was a double VS Seeker, but specifically for Nimona. Obviously Nimona just that draw 3 supporter, not a very strong effect when we have things like Avery and Worker in the format, but possibly it could be like a one-of mini package in Goldengo where you are going to be slamming Pokestop so frequently that you don't mind Nimona hitting the discard pile because you could hit the Backpack, then get them Nimona and continue to draw expansive hand sizes. I think it's absolute garbage right now because you have to play the 4 Worker in Goldengo, but maybe once we see rotation and Path of the Peak's gone and we're still going down a heavy Pokestop route with Goldengo, there's maybe a chance for the supporter. I still think most likely not, but it's at least a talking point card. Then we have the Technical Machine Crisis Punch. Just like all the other TMs, it discards itself at the end of the turn, so you have to sort of time this card correctly, and the Crisis Punch itself only works when your opponent has exactly 1 prize card remaining, but for 3 colorless energy, you get to dish out 280 damage. That's a really, really solid threshold, actually, helping you get through V-Star Pokemon and also get through Pidgeot EX as well. And the 3 colorless energy cost is kind of interesting because we do have a lot of great energy acceleration in the game right now. And if you can play a majority of single prizes in your deck, you can try and force that crisis situation when your opponent only has that 1 prize card remaining. And in that window of opportunity, you can get this huge amount of burst damage. The main thing that springs to mind is that we have great reduction as well from Lost Provisions and from Excited Heart from Cram and Zard, which could already be in a deck together, to be honest with you, and you get the opportunity to get this Crisis Punch off. We know there's Arvid in the format, we know there's Town Store in the format, so there are situations where you can pull out the Crisis Punch in the right situation. I think it's most likely going to be in this sort of Lost Box deck. We could actually have a Zardless Lost Box that still has this late game where you have the Crisis option to just swing quite aggressively. I think Radzard is still pretty important in some Lost Zone builds because you still need to have an answer to Iron Hands, and at the moment, Raihan, DTE, and Gate are great ways to do that. But I could see some adaptation for some Lost Zone decks that are trying to work this in, because 280 is a much better threshold than Combustion Blast 250, and if Lost Zone decks get to play Greninja rather than Radzard and still have this great late-game strategy, it seems like a big payoff to me. Onto the Moonlit Hill Stadium card. Japan has had this for the longest time, and they play this card in almost every one of their Gardevoir builds. It's typically going alongside the likes of Collapse Stadium and Artisan, but it definitely seems like it's a worthy 1/2 count within these decks, where once during each player's turn, they may discard a basic Psychic from their hand in order to heal 30 damage from their Pokemon. This is pretty obviously synergistic with the Gardevoir archetype. Push the Brainwave into 1-hit KO range, similar to how we've seen Champions Festival every now and then pop up in Gardevoir. Not too popular, to be honest with you, but it does still allow that great math fixing with Brainwave. At the same time, though, you can also pre-set up things like Curly on your bench, and you get the heal across your entire board, which is really, really helpful, actually, so that not only is the active Arcana Gardevoir pushed into 1-hit KO range, but possibly even the Curlier getting an energy banked and then healed off means that your next Brainwave, the sort of following attack, could also get enough damage onto it on the following turns to push through with future Brainwaves. So I think it really helps alongside these reversal energies to make sure that your Brainwave is dealing enough damage throughout the entire game, and at the same time it's giving you that upside, that protection against like the Rapid Strike archetypes, the Valiant decks, devolving strategies as well. So it seems like a very versatile card where it's helping against Path of the Peak in general, gives you this 1-hit KO potential, and helps against some of your dodgier matchups like the Rapid Strike deck. Onto a couple of EXs then. The Epathra EX I think is probably going to be worth experimenting with. It is a grass type, it has that terrestrial mechanic where it can't be hit on the bench, and it also has an ability, the Dazzling Gaze. As long as this Pokemon is in the active spot, attacks used by your opponent's active cost 1 more. Can be a frustration for some archetypes. Yes, we have a lot of great energy acceleration in the format, Gardevoir, Charizard, Mirage Gate, these sorts of things, but you're still forcing extra energy committed to just one Pokemon. Sometimes that's going to be a headache, certainly for the likes of like Roaring Moon and Miraidon, these like turbo decks that do have that burst energy but need to rebuild turn by turn by turn. This Gaze can eventually become a headache, especially if we are weaving in those late game Ionas and such. So I do think this ability is pretty solid. Yes, there's still going to be Path in the format for a few months, but something to bear in mind. The grass typing is also something to be really aware of, because this is going to be helpful into the Charizard matchup, because Psyball actually can 1-hit KO Charizard if there's enough energy shared between the Pokemon. The Psyball for 1 Psych Energy does 30 plus 30 more for each energy attached to both active Pokemon. Charizard typically will have 2 energy on it, but if it's had to knock out an Epathra EX on the previous turn, or at least attack into an Epathra EX, it will have 3 energy on it. So an Epathra EX would only require 2 energy on itself to get a response KO onto a Charizard, or 3 energy if the Charizard has the usual requisite of 2 energy attached to it. So that's actually quite easy to come by, because the little Flittle is a Psychic type, so it can synergize with Shadow Rider, Calyrex VMAX. It can work with Xatu because of our Psychic energy attack cost. It could even go alongside some Lost Zone decks that have Psychic energy for Sableye, and you have the splash of Epathra as a type coverage attacking presence. So actually kind of an interesting one. As long as Charizard's popular in the format, there's some reason to look at this card, because it's just fairly well staffed on a stage 1, fairly low maintenance as well, and can cause headaches to many archetypes as the game progresses. There's also a single prize Epathra, which has a stance ability, which is quite powerful, where it prevents all damage and effects of attacks when you evolve into it this turn. So you can try and buy free turns, force your opponent to boss around you, force them to have escape ropes, this sort of thing. You only do 70 base damage for 2 energy, but if there's a Tulip supporter in your discard pile, you could do 70 plus 70 more damage. This isn't as good as a Clara, obviously, but it could be an okay supporter if you're trying to have this Epathra package in a Lost Zone deck. So possibly you could have this 1 EX, 1 stage 1 as like a 2-1-1 split in a Lost Zone variant to give yourself type coverage, an annoying stance effect for like other single prize matchups and such, because an Epathra in the active using stance plus a Jirachi on board can be a real headache for Lost Zone box players, certainly. So I think there can be situations for this archetype to maybe spring up. I don't think it's going to be that powerful, but it's at least intriguing to me, and I've already seen some murmurs about this card being a sort of controlling archetype. Don't know how good that's going to be just yet, but yeah, it seems like the combination of the non-EX and the EX might be an interesting thing to experiment with. Onto a very big, ancient, basic Pokemon, the Great Tusk EX. 250 hit points fighting type with that ancient tag, so we can buff it with ancient boost energy capsule all the way up to 310 on a basic, which is pretty insane. The big downside, however, is its ability. Once at the end of your turn, if this Pokemon is in the active spot, you must discard the top 5 cards of your deck. That is a big problem. That means that in your deck building process, you're either going to have a lot of recovery cards, or extra counts of cards that are going to be important to you, lots of switching cards to get this guy out of the active so your ability doesn't proc, or some copies of Path of the Peak to shut down your own Quaking Demolition. The good news is it's always at the end of your turn, so even if the opponent does bounce your path, you're not going to self-mill. You have a turn to like re-establish a path or get Great Tusk Tusk out of there. So the milling itself should only be few and far between. It shouldn't actually come up that often. So typically this is just a really high statted Pokemon, to be honest with you. 250 hit points with great bash as well. The attack for 1 fighting and 3 colorless is 260, and it isn't affected by any effects on your opponent's active Pokemon. That's actually amazing. To have such a high damage output wall breaker is crazy. Now the attack cost itself is kind of the most awkward thing here. Even with things like Sada, Energy Switch, stuff like that, even with Koraidon EX, I still think it's going to be too hungry of an attacker. Maybe like a one-of in other like fighting style toolboxes, maybe with the help of Sandy Shocks and stuff like that. We have also seen that Roaring Moon has been able to splash in like Lightning Energy for an Iron Hands play or Water Energy for a Greninja. This is at least an ancient Pokemon, so might have a little bit more synergy if you just splash like 2 Fighting Energy in a Roaring Moon deck. You could have the great bash option. Now the one thing I will say is Roaring Moon certainly isn't going to be a deck that likes to play Path itself, so the synergy doesn't quite add up here. There's some awkward, some clunkiness here. The main thing I've seen from Japan is just combining it with Garchomp EX to try and help fulfill that attack cost, and it means that you have another attacker that you can use throughout the game whilst having just 1 or 2 turns of coming in with a Great Tusk and having this big damage output potential, and combining it with Path of the Peak so you're shutting off your own awkward ability. I think there's too much kind of going on with the card, and I feel like even though it is overstated, it's a little bit expensive for its cost. Overall, it's similar to like a Slacking V with a few more tanking options, but overall it's not that impressive. We also have an Iron Treads EX. It's a future basic Pokemon, and it has the Ironclad roll for 2 metal and 1 colorless. It deals 150. After doing damage, you can discard a future boost energy capsule from this Pokemon, and if you do, during your opponent's next turn, this Pokemon takes 150 less damage from attacks. With the 1 colorless in attack cost, it makes me think that it could go inside some sort of Lost Zone variant. We already have the basic Zamazenta, of course, so having Metal Energy isn't too far-fetched within a deck like this. The Ironclad roll does quite low damage output, unfortunately. Even with a future boost energy capsule attached, you're only doing that 170, which isn't all that impressive. Maybe this is a card that lies in wait for the help of Iron Crown to boost your damage output that little bit more. As long as you are discarding your future boosters, this is actually a tankier Pokemon than Hisui and Goodra. The one thing I will say is that, of course, Goodra has that built-in Moisture Star, which can get a lot more value. So overall, I think that the Goodra is probably the better card of the two right now, because you're still having to warp your deck and commit spaces to having multiple future boost energy capsules. You have to time these correctly. You have to make sure you have them on the specific turns and whatnot. So it's going to be an interesting build, possibly, of a Lost Zone deck. That's the main thing that I'm thinking of now, is like an upgrade or at least side grade to Goodra. One of the things that is certainly awkward, though, for a tanking style archetype is that we have that fire weakness, which is terrible because Radiant Zard can be teched into a couple of decks right now and completely swing a matchup. The other 2 cards that are worth noting is that we have a new Charmeleon and Frigibax. The Charmeleon has the Flare Veil ability, preventing all effective attacks used by your opponent's Pokemon done to this Pokemon. I feel like this is actually worse than the current 90 hit point Charmeleon that we have in the format, because the Combustion attack, just the 2 for 50, isn't going to help you get through the likes of Mimikyu, which the current 90 hit point Charmeleon does do. But if you are playing a split of Charmeleon, as in more than 1 90 hit pointer, I do think playing 1 and 1 of this new one makes sense, because there are some certain situations where you can search this out and it saves you committing a bench space to like a Jirachi or whatnot if you are trying to block yourself from Sableye turns. I think overall it's niche, but it could end up being an additional copy, certainly for like TM Evolution builds. But if you are just choosing to play 2 Charmeleon right now to protect yourself against devolution, for example, I think a 1-1 split is pretty justified. And then also the Frigibax, it has a 2 retreat cost like the other 70 hit pointer, but this is an upgrade in terms of having a decent attack. Just draw 1 for 1 water is okay. As we've seen historically with Chien-Pao, it's typically going to be 60 hit pointers, and every now and then there's a discussion around adding in 170 hit point Pokemon, and I think that's why this Frigibax will also see a little bit of play. And then just because Gym Leader Challenge has been on my mind recently, I did just want to touch on a couple of interesting stage 1s. Lantern can dish out 200 damage if it has water energy attached within that attack cost, which can all be paid via a reversal energy, and we know that Lightning is already very good at splashing other energies within its deck. Certainly the blend energy works with the Lantern quite nicely as well, and counter energy. All of these can work quite well in a Raikou based build of Lightning, which seems pretty good. And Camerupt is a new stage 1 attacking option for fire, where if it also has a fighting energy attached, you get to deal 240 damage. That's a monstrous monstrous threshold that's really helping you wall break, which means I think we could easily start seeing some reversal / counter energies making it into even the fire archetype as well, which is looking pretty promising, because combos like this is actually going to be really good in fire when you already have things like Smooth Over to try and make it come together quite easily. That's it then for the Paldean Fates set review, one of the fastest set reviews I've ever done, and it's because there aren't that many impressive cards. A couple of interesting ones here and there. I'm sure there will be some experimentation of the new stuff. Overall, it's going to be interesting to see how Moonlit Hill interacts with Gardevoir, already one of the top contenders, and it's going to be more flexible now, more interesting, more ways to one-hit KO stuff and push that threshold of Brainwave, which I think is really important. And some cards to experiment with in terms of Lost Zone engines, which as we know is another really popular one in the game right now. So it feels like there's just enough to freshen things up a little bit. Let me know your favourite cards from the set, your favourite artworks, and what you're going to be experimenting with from Paldean Fates. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow for another video. Cheers.